Let me start by explaining something that will look a bit fiddly. I had a cataract operation a few months ago, and the surgeon said to me, "Do you want long sight or short sight?" And I said, "Well, I'll go for long sight." So when I start putting my specs on, I'm not being fussy. It's just I need reading specs now, instead of needing them all the time. That's just a bit of a preempt, a pre-start. I want to start with a question. How many people, how many schools that you represent have a motto in Latin? Could you hold up your hand? So I would say coming up in the half of you. So Sequamur is the motto of Stornoway Nicholson Institute. And it means, let us follow. And there was a time, of course, when no one who was doing any kind of serious education would not do Latin. The grammar school, in St. Paisley Grammar School, is there because the grammar involved was Latin. And you worked through Latin to English. When I went to Edinburgh, among the dinosaurs, you had to have a qualification, at least at lower level, in Latin. Now, why am I saying this? Because I want to draw attention to the way that Donald Murray has picked up this particular language issue, but it's also a cultural issue with regard to the work of William John Gibson, who was the headmaster during the First World War of Nicholson Institute. And one of the things that lies behind the play is that when his daughter died, she donated his papers to the Outer Hebrides Heritage Collection. So when in the play of Sequamur we find letters that are coming from his pupils, these are extracts of letters actually coming from the pupils to him in the war. And we'll come to the significance of that in a moment. Just going to try and call up a map here on the... Here's the second... Right. Okay, I just wanted this as a background because what we're looking at here is the Dardanelles. So up the Sea of Marmara, then you're on to Istanbul, Constantinople. And when the boys at the end of this play, or halfway through the play, end up in Gallipoli, they're here, Cape Helles. And just up the Dardanelles is a place that is now called Anzac Cove, where the New Zealanders and the Australians landed. And they were, because of an error in navigation, instead of being landed on a flat plain, they were landed at the foot of cliffs. And they went up those cliffs in 24 hours, all under Turkish fire. Now, that's, meantime, down here on Cape Helles is what is actually intended to be a distraction for the main attack here. Why is that map interesting to me, and perhaps to you, is that here are the ruins of Troy. Has anyone been to Troy in the room? 2 or 3 of you, yeah. So you know that when you stand on that site, you can see Cape Helles. These two sites are inextricably geographically linked. Why is that important? Well, what I want to suggest to you is this, is that not only is the issue of the school motto in Latin in the title of the play, which means let us follow. It's a kind of incentive. It's not we're going to follow, it's let us follow. Is that actually carries within it an implication for the young men that Gibson is headmaster to. And of course, some of these mottos cover rather unfortunate, to put it in the worst, and actually horrifying facts. I went to a school which was founded by a man called John McNabb. And the school's motto was Juventutus Vivo Fortunas, which means of youth I carry the fortunes. And we all thought, oh, that's great, we're all going to get out and learn things and become what we are and maybe even aspire to be teachers. What we didn't know at the time was he was also a slave ship owner. So when that motto says, I carry the fortunes of youth, among the youth whose fortunes he carried were the young people who were in their ships being taken to slavery. So what we're looking at here is the ways in which empire, attitudes of empire, attitudes of colony are embedded in that Latinization. It's that whole thing. Look at the architecture of America, which a certain person is in danger of demolishing. It's based on Roman Empire. When a statue of Boadicea is put on the other side of Westminster Bridge from the Houses of Parliament, it says underneath in a slab, her descendants will conquer empires much greater than those of Rome who persecuted her. It's a rough paraphrase. So the very conscious sense at the time of the First World War among empires, and particularly in the British Empire, of a link to imperialism and indeed to classical life. So, on page 4 of the play, we have the first introduction of Homer. He says, Gibson says, looking at the names of the pupils who've died in the war, First World War, Homer got it right, when he said, like the generations of leaves, the lives of mortal men. So instantly, our playwright is saying, I'm bringing in Homer, I'm bringing in one of the greatest poets of Western civilization, but a poet of war. The Iliad is about dreadful things, books after books written by some kind of poet, we don't know who he is, perhaps it's a collection of poets panning on through oral tradition. But for warriors, when one reads the Iliad, and I don't know who else read it through from cover to cover, but when I read it through from cover to cover, I only did that quite in the last 20 years. I always just read bits. And there are moments when you think, this is gruesome. This is actually, it will describe how a spear goes into someone's back, through their pelvis, into their bladder, and it kills them. So that what's happening with Homer and the Iliad is that within a military civilization, in that case Greek, he's glorifying war and assuming that people in war will enjoy being told about people dying. Like generations of leaves, the lives of mortal men. Very quickly though, and this is why I've got the map up here so early, is we go to Gallipoli. And we go to, on page 5, we get the first reference to Gallipoli at the bottom of the page, as he's reading through the name of someone who died there. He was in the Ross Mountain Battery, went to Gallipoli. But what's slightly chilling about this guy dying, Finlayson, is his name's not on the plaque. There are 148 boys whose names are on that memorial plaque. And one of the things that Donald Murray picks up is even in that context of memorialisation, people get forgotten. We'll find more out about Finlayson as we get into the play. So it's a very rich play, a very startling play in terms of the way it ties in the life of this school in Stornoway and in the tradition of Scottish secondary education to classical education. And the fact that, frankly, when I went to school, again with the dinosaurs, anyone who was likely to go to university would be put into a classics course. Just a matter of course. We all did Latin. And that's another world, of course. But it's a world that Donald Murray picks up very well. You'll notice how often he picks up references to the classics on the assumption that his students will know at once whatever he says in Latin. I mean, the scary thought is that when lectures were given in Edinburgh University up until 1720, they would be given in Latin. Not Scots, not English, but Latin. Thank God it wasn't at my time. The slogan or the motto on the memorial plaque, "They died that we might live," carries within it a whole implication that, as with classic sagas, with classic legends, with books like the Iliad, men go out to die to protect others, women, other men, children, and that's just what you do. So when we get to scene 2, when we get to the point at which it's made very clear that Duncan Finlayson and another boy, Alexander MacIver, are forgotten, then the very act of honouring them and honouring those who went is flawed. And one of the key things Sequamur explores is the issue of flaw. Flaw in memory, flaw in value, flaw in this case, in the First World War, the clash of empires, and the concept behind the empires of colonialism. So, if we go to scene 3, we have the beginning of the use of the Iliad as in quotation. But not just the Iliad, also the Aeneid. And the Aeneid is named after Aeneas, the son of Priam, the king of Troy, one of the only princes to get out of Troy alive after the Greeks attacked Troy. And Aeneid, of course, is, in Roman myth, the founder of Rome. And the Aeneid is written by Virgil, and the assumption is, as Gibson says, goes back to that quotation we said, like the generation of leaves, the lives of mortal men, now the wind scatters the old leaves across the earth, now the living timber bursts with the new buds, and springs come round again, and so with men. Men, notice, not women. As one generation comes to life, another dies away. And then Gibson goes on to say, Bella horrida, bella, et fibrium multo spumante sanguine eterno. Finlayson, translating to English. I see wars, says Finlayson. Too slow again. Patterson, you're expected in this culture to have such a grasp of Latin that if someone speaks to you in Latin, you can instantly translate it. You don't take time. And the translation of Patterson is I see wars, horrible wars, and the Tiber flowing with much blood. Now you recognise that quotation, Tiber flowing with much blood, in Britain in the 70s, early 70s, became a phrase of great controversy because Enoch Powell used that quotation to argue against immigration and multicultural society. So I see that he imagined the idea, when he spoke in Birmingham, of a race war. And we see that as an under-theme of the extreme right in this country still. And again, it's no surprise that Murray picks up this quotation from the Aeneid to do two things. One is to remind us of how much the children who go to die, as we learn in Gallipoli, were inculcated with a vision of a certain kind of imperial culture which was seen as the forerunner of the British Empire. And the second thing is how in modern politicians a lot of that culture has become subverted, corrupted, and used in racially divisive ways. So, as we go on, we get the reference to Sarajevo, and then on page 8, we go to Troy with the Iliad in your knapsack. So this is a kind of carrying forward of the Greek myth, which relates to a real war. I mean, there's no doubt that Troy existed. The ruins have been discovered. Schliemann, the archaeologist, made rather a mess of the ruins, but there's been modern archaeology done, and there was a great civilization in Troy, which the Greeks wanted to destroy because, of course, if you look at my little map up here, there's the Dardanelles. That's a trade route, still is a major trade route into the Black Sea. And if we're talking about modern parallels, the north of the Black Sea are the wheat fields of the Ukraine. And the suggestion is when you have the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece is a metaphor for the wheat of Ukraine. So when the Greeks attacked Troy, it might be about Helen, maybe. That's a nice story. But actually, it's about economic power. So when you go to Turkey with the Iliad in your knapsack, you're carrying the mythification of a certain kind of brutal war, but actually you're involved in a war which is a war of empires. The war of the Turkish Empire and the British Empire, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the Italian, the Japanese. Forget the Japanese were on the British and the British side in the First World War. So it's a kind of carrying forward into the period of this play of issues that still are alive. What we have, however, with Gibson is a vision of war in a different sense. He actually says there's no competition. There's no comparison between this war and the Boer War, where one of the boys' fathers fought. The war for Gibson is a way for the poor to prize away power from princes and politicians. If young men like you, he says to Patterson, like to go out and fight in this war, there is no way they can refuse to make the changes necessary to transform our society, to allow the people chances for people like us. He's the son of a farm labourer, in my case. Patterson says, but to go to Serbia, Turkey, what do these places have for us? Gibson says, you can say that after reading the Iliad. Really? Have you learned nothing? The walls of Troy are to be found in that last place. The whole of our civilization has its foundation there. Going there will give you an opportunity I never had. It will widen your vision, says Gibson. Add to your knowledge of the halls of learning that your teachers have opened up for you. This is a vision of war that we might not quite share. And it's a vision of war, however, that was valid among serious thinkers at the time of the First World War. We're looking at context. If you ever get the chance to show your students Richard Attenborough's film, Oh, What a Lovely War, which is an adaptation of Joe Littlewood's stage play about the First World War, there's a moment there that tells you a great deal about attitude. And there's a song, we don't want to lose you. I won't sing it, I'll speak it. We don't want to lose you. We think you ought to go. Your king and your country both need you so. And one of the young men who've learned in a family context is so taken by this song, which is sung in the film by the late Maggie Smith, sees her as an enormously glamorous music hall artist who is bringing him and recruiting him, and she is recruiting him to go into the army. And he goes up onto the stage, and there's a moment when, very cleverly, Attenborough closes in on her, and we see she's not a gorgeous young 20-year-old, as many of us are. She's actually someone who's made up. She's falsified by makeup and stage makeup. And she's dragging this young man into the war. So there's a whole ethos of warmongering which is going on, and Murray is drawing our attention to. There's also a pressure, everyday pressure. There's a line that doesn't entirely make sense if you forget why it makes sense. And it's halfway down the page, McCrae, who's the deputy head and actually was Gibson's successor, says, for all that it's... Yes, Gibson quotes from Shakespeare in this case. In peace, as nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. McCrae says, well, I'm not so sure. For all that it's happening all over the country, the flag waving, the seagulls being plucked clean of feathers. Now, why are they being plucked clean of feathers? You probably know, is that seagulls' feathers are white. And young men who hadn't joined up would be approached by women in the street and given a white feather, accusing them of cowardice. So there's enormous pressure, enormous social pressure on young men to go and be recruited in the army, go and serve. And some would go and lie about their age. You could only join at 16. They'd go at 15, even 14, and tell the recruiting sergeant they were old enough to join. And there wasn't, my own grandfather went in the Territorial Army, and he joined up, and he was wounded within 79 days on a night patrol in the Western Front, and he was left because they had to get back, and he was in such pain, he was groaning, and his colleagues went to bring him in, and they brought him in, or I wouldn't be here. And I was talking to a friend, Trevor Royal, who's a military historian, and his view on that was, well, yeah, that happened. The officers hated it. They hated it because the men were material. And if you had 3 or 4 men going out to bring a wounded man, instead of losing 1 man out there, you might lose 5, because the Germans might see them. This is a whole attitude to people and to individuals in war that we would find quite alien, but that's how it was. And young women and middle-aged women were going up to young men in the street and saying you were a coward because you weren't there. And in fact, Grandad, when he came back, it was a war wound. It smashed his left elbow. He never could go and serve again. He used to call it a blighty wound. He was a miner in Fife, McCabe and Cardendale. So he had to go back down the pits, and for the rest of his life he was howking coal with an arm he couldn't move, his elbow in. Imagine the pain. So when he came back, he was put in a special blue uniform. And the reason they had a blue uniform for wounded soldiers is that early in the war, soldiers who were brought back wounded from the front didn't have a uniform and were being given white feathers. So this is what I call militarization, which Murray deals with so lightly, I won't say gently, but with delicately, and just brings to us the horrors that are going on. You also have a whole attitude to Scots in the Empire on page 11, very interesting. There's a misprint, by the way, which we only just discovered. I apologise for that. But 2/3 of the way down, there's a reference to a guy called Maguire in Australia. I checked up with Donald. It's a typo. It's Macquarie, a guy called Lachlan Macquarie, who was the governor of New South Wales. And he was the governor of New South Wales, Lachlan Macquarie, when he was also there for the governor of Tasmania. So part of his role when he was governor of New South Wales was to supervise the genocide of the Aborigines in Tasmania. And in that list of names, we have Livingstone in Africa, who unquestionably argued and fought not physically, but morally against the slave trade but also you have Carnegie in America. Carnegie in America was a great philanthropist eventually on the basis of the money he took out of strike breaking and giving men very bad wages. And did write a play about Carnegie. My mother was a Carnegie related to Andrew. And and she had no romantic ideas about Andrew Carnegie, the philanthropist. The play then jumps centuries, not centuries, but scene into the war lines, you have a scene with the Germans in scene 5. Suddenly, from Gibson's study, the man who's been advocating boys going to the war breaks into his study, and you have the Hande hoch cries, Soldier 1, you filthy Germans, Schnell, Schnell, Gibson. Numerous were injured, and one shell killed numerous others. And then the Soldier 1, who is about to die, says, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Psalm 23. The cultural interactions going on in this play are terrifically rich, terrifically vibrant, and often quite chilling. So we have the idea that a key point to bear in mind about the location of the play in Stornoway, or at least based in Stornoway, is that Stornoway at that time was owned by a man called James Matheson. And James Matheson bought Lewis in the 1840s and built Lewis Castle, which is now linked into the UHI. And how did he make his money? Through a firm called Jordan Matheson in Hong Kong. And how did they make the money? By selling opium in China, by the drug trade. And when the Chinese objected and destroyed 20,000 crates of opium, his partner Jordan came back, saw the Foreign Secretary, and we had the first Opium War. And British fleets were sent in and soldiers and defeated the Chinese and forced them to accept the sale of opium, or as we would say now, heroin, throughout the Chinese Empire. So what the moral complications in this play, embedded, and the joy for me as a writer is the way that Murray embeds them, doesn't push them in your face. They're there for you to fight, to recognise, and to realise. So we get later in the play the horror of war. We get one of the letters I mentioned in the archive quoted, and one of the boys writes back how it was calm when we left Lemnos, which is just down here, below Kumkala, an island. You remember that name, Gibson? Lemnos. Lemnos appears in a Greek tragedy where the men deserted all the women folk. We got lectures about what to expect when we arrived in Gallipoli. The fierce reception committee, says Campbell, that was probably coming our way. The Turks have a lot of guns there. The Turks were well entrenched. They weren't stupid. The general in charge of Gallipoli, facing the Anzacs, was Kemal Ataturk, who's now more famously known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, the president. Not entirely a nice man, but a great politician in general. And there was no way, frankly, that the Turks were going to let the Allied soldiers through. So when they left Lemnos, feeling calm and peaceful, they were facing a certain kind of hell. So where does Gibson stand in all of this? Well, Gibson continues to think that it was right to send out the boys. He continues to believe in the value of what he persuaded them to do. Let us follow, he said to them. Let us follow. But then there's a wonderful reversal by Donald Murray of one of the cliches what an Anglo-Saxon poet would have called a kenning, when Homer always talks of the sea as being wine dark, the wine dark sea. But when the boys are landing at Cape Helles, they're landing off a landing craft that's ground onto shore, and they're coming up using this as a bridge. And anyone who's been there knows that's a very exposed position. And the sea is wine dark at that point, as Murray points out, because it's full of blood and bodies. Not because of some romantic image, but because of what's happened to Gibson's pupils. When we get to page scene 7, we get a list of the names, and we get the fact that for Gibson it was still the idea that you'd make a better world out of the First World War. He still kind of believed that. And one of his pupils comes back to him and says, "You're a well-travelled man, Finlayson." This is the ghost of Finlayson, because Finlayson's the one who's dead and whose name's been missed off the board. "You're a well-travelled man since you hung up your headmaster's cloak, Mr. Gibson. Remember, in those days, I bet none of you do this, all the teachers would wear their academic gowns to teach. You couldn't teach without your academic gowns. My school was burned down at one point, not by me, but by them. And the head of the classics department could not teach without his gown. And he went into his wardrobe and came out with an old gown that was so old, the black in it had turned green. And he still had to wear that to teach. And you've been to Italy, seen the good work of Mussolini there. He clicks his heel, raises his arms in a fascist salute. Meglio un giorno da leone che cento la de pecora. Translate, Gibson, says Finlayson. This is the reversal. It's no longer Gibson saying, translate Latin. It's the pupil, the ghost, saying, translate. It's better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. Under Mussolini? You've been to Russia, seen what communism does. And again, he quotes Marx. The failed political faiths of the 20th century, which Gibson thinks will be ways of relieving people, giving them a better life that will come out of the war. And of course, that's not quite how it comes out. So, at the end of the play, we have Gibson very reluctantly being persuaded to make a speech and unveil the plaque of the 148 names who are remembered, but not the 2 who've haunted him. And we see the deep doubt that remains in him, and yet he still somehow thinks it was worth those boys fulfilling what Achilles did, fulfilling what Hector did, fulfilling what Odysseus did, and going to Troy. But opposite Cape Helles are the ruins of Troy, not Troy. It's the site of Troy. And what now is at Kumkala, which is the cape at the end. Kumkala means sand castle in Turkish, is, and at Sidi Bahir, which is the site they landed at, is a modernist monument for the Turkish dead. And it's striking now to think where the people in that monument came within the Turkish Empire. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya. Just think about that for a second. We're dealing with something that is two-sided. And yet on that monument, there's a famous speech by Ataturk in 1933, I think it was, where he says to those who have lost their sons, "Mothers of the world, you have given us your sons, and we will take care of them," meaning he will take care of their graves. So here we have a picture of a play which in its very title implies the concept of a language of empire, a language of empire that was adopted by Scots as well as English as a language that people who were going out to be colonial rulers would learn all the time. A lingua franca, just like English. And of course the lingua franca of empire was English, and so Scots and Gaelic was suppressed in Scotland. So that, people like any of us here might go out and be able to talk to other imperial managers. All of that is rolled up in this rather wonderful play. Thank you.